All right, guys, what's up? Today we're going to start Unit 4.4. We're going to review bank balance sheets, okay? So we have this, if you guys are checking out slide number 9, I have it written out for you guys right here. So those of you guys that are following along right now, if you guys have a question, just go ahead and ask as we go through, right? Use the chat feature if that's, if you don't want to, whatever, that's fine too. So important thing to understand with bank balance sheets is that they have to be balanced, right? They have to be balanced on both sides. So your assets have to balance to your liabilities, right? And you can see right here that your total liability or your total assets is 1,000, or I'm sorry, 10,000, and your liabilities is 10,000 as well. Okay. So your demand deposits is 5,000. Your owner's equity is 5,000. That's going to equal 10,000. So it really doesn't, like, where everything is does matter, but just at the end, the first thing we want to make sure is one thing: is this balanced, right? And so it is balanced. Now, so we need to figure out. We can figure out a few things just by looking at this without really doing very much. Now, if we look over here, right, to our reserves, right? Now, our reserves are going to be our required reserves. Now, what is the reserve ratio, right? How do we figure that out? Well, you look at your demand deposits and you figure out what percentage your reserves are from your demand deposits, right? And that should give you your reserve ratio. All right. Does that make sense? Because what they did with is the owner equity and the demand deposits, what they did was they either loaned it out or they went and bought. And what they did is with the demand deposits, that's people going in and depositing money. They have to take a certain amount of that and they have to put it in the vault, right? They don't put it in the vault. They could get in trouble from the Federal Reserve or from the governing body for banks, right? So you are required by law to put in the reserve ratio, which I think is 10%. So whatever you deposit, 10% of that goes into the reserve ratio. So goes into the bank. So if someone needs to come in and withdraw money, it'll always be there. A few other reasons why, but give you the bank a little bit more security. They're not overextended, right? Okay. Other reason is with the rest of the money is part of this demand deposit, right? Goes to loans or to buying T-bonds, right? The owner equity is like all the guys and girls, right? Whatever, that got together and started the bank. Okay. So those two groups, right? That's where you're getting this 8,000 from, and your 1,500 goes to buying T-bonds, right? Or treasury bonds. Okay. So we know that our reserve ratio is 500. All right. So let's go ahead and move over to slide number 11. Okay. So this changes, the numbers change a little bit, right? So let's go ahead and change some of these. Actually, owner's equity only 5,000. So this is 20. This is going to be 5,000.
Wait, so when it says loans, is that loans that the bank has given out or loans that the bank has received?
Loans that the bank is giving out.
But isn't that, never mind.
No. That's the question.
I was going to say, can't loans be a liability too? But I guess most of the time they get paid back, so not really.
Yes. So loans are they're an asset and they are a liability, right? Because you could lose out on them as well. So good point, Josh. Yes, loans are both considered a liability and asset. But for this exercise, we're going to consider them an asset. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. All right, here we go. So I think you guys can see all that. So first thing that you want to do here is you want to make sure that you're balanced on both sides. So we are in fact balanced. You have 25,000 on your asset side, and you have 25,000 on your liability side. Your demand deposits, right? So that's people going into the bank, and they are depositing the depositing money. Okay. And then your owner's equity, that's all the owners that have put money together to start the bank, right? So the required reserves, we can see real quickly what's the reserve ratio is. The required reserve is what percentage of the required reserves is of the demand deposits. That's 10%, right? Does everybody see that that is 10% of that value? Everybody see that? Yes? Okay. So 10%, if someone were to come into the bank, they would put it in the demand deposit, right? So 10% of that value needs to be added to this reserved requirement value right here for assets, right? The rest of that will go into excess reserves. Now, excess reserves could then be used to purchase T-bonds or to purchase or to loan the money out, right? Okay, so we're gonna see here that Bob is gonna go in and he's gonna add $1,000 to the bank. So he's gonna deposit $1,000, right, from his paycheck, okay? So he goes in, right? So first thing we need to change is this side, the liability side, right? So this is gonna change to, and change this on your paper, 21,000, right? Okay, and then so down here in the total, that's gonna change to 26,000. Now, we're obviously not balanced, right? So what do we need to do? What's going to happen to this money is 10% of that 1,000 needs to be added over here to the reserve requirements, right? Now, the rest of that money needs to be added to the excess reserves, right? So you have 2,100 in required reserves and 3,900 in the excess reserves. So that gives you 26,000 on both sides of the equation if you add all of these values up. Is there any questions there with that? Okay, so if you look at the questions is how much is the reserve required reserves? Well, the required reserves is again 10%, right? We were able to figure that out two ways, right? We'll add the money, I'm sorry, but from the beginning of the equation is 2,000. And 2,000 of the demand deposit, which was 20,000, is 10%, right? Okay. And then, so how much is in excess reserve? So after the deposit of $1,000, 3,900 is in the excess reserves. Does that make sense? Okay. And then, so how much can the bank now lend out? Okay. How much can they lend out? Well, they can lend out 3,900 because that's what's in excess reserves. Remember that required reserves have to stay there. They cannot lend that out. Okay, and then so how much is that going to change the money supply from the demand deposit? Well, remember that there is the multiplier, which is 1 over the reserve ratio, right? And so the reserve ratio is 1, right? And I'm sorry, 1 over 0.1, which is 10. Yes, does everybody follow me there? So it'd be 1 over the reserve ratio, okay? And then so it'd be 1 over 0.1, that's 10. 10 is the multiplier, so you multiply the amount that goes into the excess reserves, right? So 900 times the multiplier being 10, that's gonna change the money supply by 9,000. Is that clear? Everybody kind of get that? Yes? Okay. Then let's go ahead and move over to slide number 12, okay? All right, let me change this up a little bit. So it looks like what it's supposed to. 5,000. 5,000. 2,000. 2,000. Okay, all right. So now we're going to look at this a little bit differently, right? What happens when, that was our first example, is if you deposit money. Now we're going to look at if you take money out, right? Okay, so we have a guy named Bob, right? He banks at this particular bank, right? And he wants to go in and he wants to withdraw $3,000 from his account. So he goes to teller gives him $3,000. He walks out of the bank, right? So first thing we need to do is from his demand deposits, right? From his savings account, we need to change the liability, right? So we're going to subtract 3,000 from 27, or sorry, 3,000 from 20,000. So it's going to give us 17,000. This obviously down here, the total is going to change to 22,000. Does everybody agree with me on that? Yeah? Okay. Then after that, we look over at this side, right? Now, the bank was holding 10% in reserve requirements, right? So are they going to keep the 2,000 in reserve requirements now that this has changed on the liability side? No, they're going to lower this value, right? So that they can lend it out, right? Now, the excess reserves, we'll get rid of that because that's the 3,000. So we can, oh, no, we want to keep that. Reserves, okay? So you're gonna get rid of this 3,000, right? And that's the money that Bob took out of the bank, right? Now, on this side, our totals are in fact balanced, right? But the bank is not going to keep this 2,000 that it's required to keep, right? It's required to keep 10%. So what is 10% of 17,000? 1,700, right? So now this side is going to change 1,700, right, for that reserve requirement. And since it's 1,700 is a reserve requirement, they're going to kick that 300 out here to excess reserves. What does that mean? They're going to be able to lend out that $300, right? And so that $300, if we were going to look at the multiplier effect, right, you would do 1 times 0.1, which is 10, okay? Again, you're going to multiply 10 by the 3,000, and so that's going to decrease the money, the multiplier, right? Decrease the money supply by 30,000. And then again, it was because you're going to take the withdrawal, right? That's going to have a negative effect, the withdrawal. And then, so that was 3,000. You're going to multiply that by 10. That gives you 30,000. Again, that decreases the value by 30,000. Is there any questions on how we did that? No? Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and look at Mi Tierra Bank. This is one that a lot of teachers use to show this. It's a good question. So let's go ahead and on a sheet of paper, go ahead and write this out. You want to write out the assets and the liabilities. And I'll go ahead and do that on my whiteboard while you guys are writing that out. Okay, make sure you guys are writing this stuff down. You guys are practicing. It helps you guys out in answering the question, okay? Okay, so reserve requirements be 10,000. Excess reserves 5,000. And then loans are going to be 80,000. And then you have demand deposits. And what I went ahead and did here is I just abbreviated everything for you guys. There's equity, which you feel free to abbreviate as well, right? And so this is going to be 10,000, 100,000. And this too is going to be 100,000. Okay. Okay. So let's look here real quick. Hopefully you guys have this written down. So you have your assets, right? Your assets are going to equal 10,000, or your reserve ratio, 10,000 plus your excess ratio is 5,000 plus your loans is 85,000. That's going to equal 100,000, right? Then on this side, your liability is going to be 100,000 plus your owner equity, which is 0, and then 100,000, right? So you can see on the right side, your liabilities equals your assets, which is 100,000. All right. Now, so um, So first thing we want to do is we want to see what the reserve requirement is with this, right? And our reserve requirement is 10,000. Our demand deposit's 100,000. What percentage of our reserve requirement is of our demand deposit? That's 10%. Okay, hopefully you guys can see that. What the bank can do here is the bank can obviously lend out this 5,000. That's its excess reserve. So if it lends that out, it would just move to this slot right here for loans, right? Or I could buy treasury bonds as well. Okay. So let's look at the question. So Luis withdraws $5,000 in cash from his checking account at Mi Tierra Bank. All right. So he's going to go in and he's going to walk out with money, right? So we know that that's going to negatively impact the money supply, right? How does that negatively impact the money supply? Again, remember that the reserve ratio is the multiplier, right? And since we're taking money out, the bank cannot lend that money out. So it is not getting multiplied, or there's not a magnitude involved with the deposit, right? Okay, so he's going to come in, he's going to withdraw 5,000. So first what we need to do is go to the demand deposits on the liability, right? And we need to subtract 5,000. So that's going to give us 95,000, right? Down here on our total, we'll change that to 95,000. So everybody see that pretty clear? Okay, so our balance sheet is not balanced, right? It's a different value on our liabilities than our assets. So we need to move some things around on this side as well. So if he comes in and he's going to withdraw the excess reserves, he's going to withdraw the 5,000. So we'll take that out of excess reserves. And then over here on our total, that's going to change to 95,000. And so now we're balanced. However, the bank is not going to be happy with this, right? They're going to want to keep that 10% in the reserve ratio, reserve requirement, right? And they're going to want to move the whatever value extra that they have here, they're going to want to move that to excess reserve so that they can lend that out, okay? So now let's go ahead and figure out what 10% of 95,000 is, which is how much, guys?
Isn't it 9,500?
Yes, 9,500. So how much is going to be moved to excess reserve? $500, right? So that 500 gets moved to excess reserve. Now, that 500 moving to excess reserve, good thing there is that bank can now lend out that 500, right? So, even though the guy comes in and takes all that money out, they still have money that they can lend out or make a $900 loan, right? Okay, so now there's some questions, right, that go along with this, but you should be able to answer all of those questions doing all of this stuff right here, right? Are there any questions on how to do a bank balance sheet? No questions at all? Okay, so then why don't we go ahead and do this? Let's move on to the next PowerPoint. Okay, and our next PowerPoint is going to be, make it there, guys, sorry. 4.5, okay, money markets. flip the view here. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to 4.5, the money market. Okay. Now this one's pretty easy. We're going to get a new graph, right? But it's very simple stuff, right? Let's go ahead and begin. So at any given time, people demand a certain amount of liquid assets for different reasons, right? And those two different reasons are going to be transaction money for demand. So let's say, for example, this guy's going to come over later today. He's going to pull all the weeds from my front yard, right? From the rocks out of my yard. And that's transaction money. I'm going to need cash to to pay him, right? So, I'm going to go to my wallet and pull out the whatever $40 that I'm going to pay him. And that is transaction money, right? Also, right now, some people may feel like that holding on to your money is a little safer than keeping it in the bank, right? Of course, with the pandemic and everything. So people might go and withdraw money from the bank. I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm just saying that people will hold on to money because it's less risky than other assets, right? Those are the two reasons why people would hold cash, right? Now, what's the opportunity cost of holding on to cash? Well, or putting it in a checking account, right? Because checking also has a very low or has the smallest interest rate attached to it. Now, why would you do that? Or I'm sorry, what is the opportunity cost for that? Well, what do you lose out by putting it in a checking account? Well, if you put it in a checking account, you can't buy stocks or bonds or real estate, or you can't put it in a mutual fund or whatever investment tool you want to use that ties up your money and makes it less liquid, right? So the more liquid your money is, the less interest it has that it's earning, right? And that's your opportunity cost for that. Okay. All right, moving on. So what happens to the quantity demanded of money when interest rates increase? So now, if interest rates increase, right, what are you going to want to do with your money? Okay, so if for example, if the banks start offering higher interest rates, you're going to keep your money in the bank, right? So your quantity demanded, or how much money you're going to want, how much liquid money you're going to want, right, is going to decrease, right? That's going to fall because you're going to leave the cash in the bank, right? And the other way around, right? If interest rates start to lower, right, or go down, what's the difference then, holding on to your $100 and getting like maybe a penny or two a year from a savings account, right? So you're gonna demand more money if interest is lower, right? Because there's no incentive. There's no incentive to keep it into any interest-bearing assets, right? Now, there's an inverse relationship, right? So if interests go up, quantity demanded for money goes down, right? Why is that? Because you're not going to want that cash in your hands, right? You're going to want it in the interest-bearing accounts, right? Or you want that in where it's going to be making money for you, right? And then if interest rates are down, quantity demanded for cash is up, right? So again, inverse relationship, down and up. Okay. So we got that. Okay. Now, let's see how that looks on a graph. Okay. And so our new graph is going to be the money market graph. Okay. And so on this graph, you're going to, on your vertical axis, right, is going to be your nominal interest rate. And then on your horizontal axis, it's going to be the quantity of money. Okay, so you'll see that the demand for money demanded, is going to be a downward sloping curve. Okay, so as interest rates go up, right, quantity demanded goes down. As interest rates go down, quantity demanded increases. Okay, and so Um, Now, there are shifters for the money demand curve, right? Those shifters are going to be a change in price levels, right? So if we see some inflation, right, then you're going to shift your money demand curve to the right. And then change in income, right? Like if you start making more money, that would shift money demand to the right. And then change in technology. Okay. Of course, money demand can shift inwards, right? So if there's a deflation, right, we would see it shift to the left, right? Or if everybody, like right now, right, a lot of people are not making money, right? So we would see a shift of income pushing the money demand curve to the left, and then of course a change in technology. A bunch of computers break down or whatever. There's a virus that kills all the computers. You would see a shift to the left. Okay. All right. So with that, now we're going to have a money supply curve. Okay. So now your money supply curve is going to be a vertical curve, right? Now, why is it going to be vertical? It's going to be vertical because the supply of money doesn't change, right? The Federal Reserve prints or puts out into circulation one set of money, right? So that's why this is just going to be a vertical curve, right? Now, what the Federal Reserve can do is they can manipulate this curve, right, to change interest rates, right? And what that's called is monetary policy, right? And so we'll go over the different things that the Federal Reserve can do here shortly. But again, this curve, right, is going to stay in one spot unless we shift it to the right, which would decrease our interest rates, right? Or increase our interest rates based on the money supply. And then, so why would the government or why would the Federal Reserve do that? Well, the Federal Reserve would do that if we're in a peak. They would want to raise interest rates because they want to slow down the economy, right? And then they would lower interest rates to speed up the economy, right? So if we're in a trough, so right now that we're in a pandemic, the Federal Reserve is going to probably try to lower interest rates, and they're going to lower interest rates so that more people will be taking out loans, right? I don't know how much lower they can get interest rates. They're pretty low right now as it is. Okay. So that's going to be it for us today. That covers a little bit of balance sheets, and it covers 4.5, right? On Wednesday, we'll go ahead and cover 4.6, right, and 4.7, and that will finish up. That'll finish Unit 4 for us on Wednesday. Are there any questions that you guys might have? No? Okay. Yep.
Yeah, I had a question.
Okay, go ahead, buddy.
How do we get to this class survey? Because I'm going to be honest, I didn't know we had any PCC email.
Okay, let me hold on.